So again, it points to the issue of infrastructure not being because of the lack of funding, but because of management and operational issues. And that's something that can change. It depends on who South Africans vote for.
In our latest macro review, we at the Centre for Risk Analysis unpack the state of infrastructure in South Africa. Entitled Running Out of Track, we don't focus only on the state of our railways, but also on other matters such as electricity and water, to just name a few, perhaps also touching on the state of the country's municipalities in a more roundabout way. Joining me to unpack is CRA analyst Makone Maja. Makone, thanks very much for your time with us on the CRA channel this week. Just to start off with some of your key takeaways. Obviously, the easiest is electricity. As we record the country back at stage 6 load shedding, despite the promises from our electricity minister a week ago. What do you think can potential readers and subscribers to the CRA learn from our latest macro review?
Hello, Chris, and thank you for having me. First, I want to say this was a collaborative project between myself and Hartman van Heerden, who I know you've had quite frequently on the channel. But there are primarily 3 areas that we really want to cover and do cover in the macro review. First speaks to the infrastructure expenditure, and really there we highlight capital expenditure, which means assets that are bought by various public institutions in the country. So we're talking public corporations, so that would be your state-owned entities, but we also really look at municipalities, provincial capital assets that are bought there, as well as higher learning institutions. And then secondly, we show how infrastructure has been dilapidating over the years. And for this, we provide really a range of data from all the way back in 2008 to currently, highlighting different state-owned entities and how they've been handling different infrastructure that are in their custodianship. It's not going very well there. If anything, that's the running out of track, where the running out of track title of the macro review comes from. And then lastly, we want to insert a section there on the impact the dilapidation and crumbling infrastructures had on the economy. So not only does it affect us as individuals, South Africans, but also businesses who need infrastructure as an integral key development in South Africa for them to be able to operate in a way that allows economic growth.
Quite a few people are starting to ask the question about the role of the state, and is the state going to play still a developmental role? I think that already misses the point, which is essentially that's already happening, that the state is taking on a different role, not by choice necessarily, but through its misspending priorities, not sort of targeted spending, not actually playing a developmental role, but more of a detrimental role, not just people having to deal with one form of taxation, but many layers of taxation when you now have to pay for other services that you normally should receive through the taxes that you pay. This movement now, this idea that we're seeing of public-private partnerships, what do you think of that broadly? And maybe what are some of the indicators in the macro review in that direction? Of course, not every business can afford maybe to go into this sort of partnership, can help the state as it were, but what do you think that sort of trend tells us about where things could be going?
So you're right there in your analysis that the governments have really backed themselves into a corner, right? That as they expand, they've also become an obstructionist state in that they inhibit growth from occurring in the country. And that's where you really touch on those own goals that the government really score on themselves. I think they should encourage those partnerships between themselves and private enterprises, and also claim those as government successes, right? Because that would speak to creating a conducive environment for business. And we do show this in our infrastructure macro review in that last section, where we touch on the impact of infrastructure crumbling on the economy. One of the things we show is the Aliens Risk Barometer. And there they rank the different risks in South Africa versus in the world in order of the greatest risk to the lowest risk. And what you see is where the world faces, in terms of countries, where the world faces more existential risks, so macroeconomic policy, things like inflation, pandemic, those sort of things, climate change. South Africa's risks are ones that are self-inflicted, right? So our biggest risk currently is infrastructure. And you're able to see through when the government lowered, for example, that cap it had placed on private electricity generation, and it removed it in its entirety. First, it lifted it to 100 megawatts, and then it eliminated it in its entirety. You're able to see that businesses come in and fill that space, but also innovation grows in the country, entrepreneurship grows in the country, even self-entrepreneurship, because people are able to generate electricity on their own. So I think government should not only encourage them, but claim those successes on their own, claim those successes for themselves, because that also speaks to government creating an environment that's business friendly.
Makone, very rightly, people's attention focuses on load shedding and electricity constraints. Are there any indicators in the macro review around water infrastructure and the state of water? Should, not to put you on the spot too much, but should people expect maybe a day zero in certain provinces or certain metros that maybe the Western Cape was on the verge of a few years ago and then implemented the steps necessary to try and mitigate that and minimize it as much as possible? Do you think that sort of thing can become ever more of a reality?
So we have three tables in the macro review that touch on water. One is the state of South African dams. And there we're able to show that actually a lot of our dams are nearly at full capacity. So that's a good thing, right? But it's the other infrastructure failures that really infringe on the state of dams, in that you're not able to pump water because of electricity and load shedding. And so that's really where you see water supplies start to suffer. Two of the other graphs are the blue drop reports. So that's the drinking water, the state of drinking water in the country. There they provide us, the Department of Water and Sanitation provides us with a blue drop risk rating. And what you're looking for there is a low score, right? So it's called the blue drop risk rating, and you want your risk to be fairly low, the risk of drinking water to be fairly low. And there's really only one province in the country that ranks there as low risk drinking water, and that's the Western Cape. All the other countries drinking water are between the categories of medium risk to critical risk, which is really terrible. I mean, how do we as a country move forward without basic access to drinkable water? The second graph we show there is the green drop report, and that speaks to the state of wastewater systems in the country. And there again, most of our wastewater systems are between the states poor and critical, which again, it speaks to things like hygiene. There's constantly a lot of coverage in the news about, for example, pit toilets or poor lavatories in poor communities in South Africa. But if you look at metros or even bigger cities in the country, the state of wastewater systems there is not very encouraging either.
And Makone, just a last question on sort of reasons for, not for hope or for optimism, maybe that's too easy a word, but where you see some of the gaps and opportunities, as it were, where maybe in the macro review there are indicators where some provinces or metros are doing better than others, and what one could learn from those places, when we don't say we're going to expect that everything to be fixed overnight, but if you can get some of these basic processes going in a better direction, pointed in a better direction, get more buy-in, you've got sort of business, civil society, local communities, maybe then we can start building these sorts of pockets of excellence.
There is a sort of bittersweet moment in the macro review for me, and it's right in the beginning of the chapter where we touch on capital expenditure. And you see the sort of inverse relationship between the money provided or a budgetary allowance granted to public institutions versus to higher learning institutions. And the inverse relationship is that the bigger the budget allocated, the lesser value you derive in services from those institutions. And that's, for example, municipalities and state-owned entities, right? So you see that higher learning institutions, which I think are some of the best run, most efficiently run institutions in the country, who receive the smallest portion of the budget, run best. So again, it points to the issue of infrastructure not being because of the lack of funding, but because of management and operational issues. And that's something that can change. It depends on who South Africans vote for. It depends on public policy and who it allows to be deployed in those various offices. So it's not all doom and gloom, and this can very well change if South Africa moved away from the sort of cadre deployment to a more meritocracy system of facilitating and employing people in public corporations.
Thank you very much for watching. To gain access to our latest macro review, as well as all of our other reports and our weekly risk alerts, we invite you to become a subscriber of the CRA. You can find all of the information at the link in the description below. Until next time, this has been Chris Hattingh for the Centre for Risk Analysis. Take care.